Hello, I'm Frank Duff. Welcome to this version of the Tidal Cyber Fireside Chat series. We got this covered. I have with me today Matt Polak from Picnic, offering some great insights from a company that's a little bit atypical of a lot of the things we think of when we think about enterprise security. So really excited to have him on and his unique perspective to show you how Picnic is leveraging attack, why they're taking part in the Tidal registry, as well as explore their unique value proposition that they're bringing to the table. So really looking forward to having this conversation and this new way of thinking, frankly, around attack. So Matt, why don't you provide a little bit of introduction to yourself and Picnic?
Thanks, Frank. Glad to be here and excited to be collaborating with your team and with Tidal. I think you guys are doing some great stuff. So really appreciate the the invite to come on the talk. Just very quick background on Picnic. For those that don't already know, PICNIC is actually an acronym that stands for the problem in the chair, not in the computer. So we think that's a great way for talking about all the challenges that humans have working with technology, which really, kind of at its core is a problem that relates to social engineering. And that is what we are mainly focused on at PICNIC. We talk about that sometimes through the lens of what we call human attack surface protection as well, because, we'll talk a little bit about this as we get into it, but for those that are already knowledgeable about social engineering, this won't be new, but essentially the thing to really know about a social engineering attack is that the first thing that happens before you get attacked is that someone does reconnaissance on you, and they do research on you and on your organization. And that sort of attack surface, that human attack surface reconnaissance, is actually core and central to solving this problem of social engineering. And so that's we sort of talk about social engineering and human attack surfaces being interchangeable in a little bit of a way there, because it's really all about that open source intelligence, or OSINT, that's out there that fuels those attacks.
I think that's a really interesting dimension. Attack has this concept for those that are more accustomed to the enterprise matrix, if you will. The enterprise matrix includes now resource development as well as reconnaissance, which are two tactics. Not to get into the over specifics of attack, but two tactics that used to exist in a matrix called pre-attack.
They were in pre, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and pre-attack was just that. I mean, it was a play on words, but it was the things that our adversaries would do before they get to enterprise attack. And I think one of the interesting things about what you guys are providing is historically those two attacks are kind of ignored from a defensive perspective, right? Everybody's concentrating on initial access, keep the bad guys out. Maybe some advanced organizations are also kind of going with the post-breach, assumed breach model, where it's like, all right, I got to do EDR and NDR and find the bad guy within. But you guys are tackling an interesting problem in the fact that like these two tactics are typically not part of enterprise security. So how do you manage that bridge to get organizations to think about that, what, these other two tactics exist and you can do stuff there?
Yeah, so it's been an interesting evolution, I think, and I think actually MITRE ATT&CK has been a very helpful mechanism for us as we've talked about, why these things are important and how they fit into the broader security program. And I think our mindset, the way that we think about this and the way that our customers have thought about this, is actually one of shifting left. It's thinking in sort of the MITRE framework terms, right? So shifting left and actually trying to make it harder, make it more expensive for your people to be targeted, for your organization to be targeted. Most attackers are opportunists, and that's the truth, right? They're business people. It's funny to think about it that way, but if we can actually make it more difficult and more expensive to come after Frank and to come after Matt, then it's likely that they will move on to easier targets, right? And so that's a big emphasis in terms of how we think about solving this problem, is actually just making it harder to come after you and reducing the number of attacks that come into the SOC that require those things, Frank, that you were talking about, right? The incident response, the assumed breach, not that those things aren't important and critical, they are, but it's great to actually have, 5 or 10 or 20% less attacks that you're dealing with in your environment, so that you can really focus on resolving those ones that you do have that are serious,
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the phrases that you used was the human attack surface. So like what does that actually mean to you? What does that mean for the end users? What are you guys actually protecting against?
Yeah, so when we started the company, one of the things that we did is we actually went out and we interviewed a wide range of folks that are really experts on this topic. And when I say experts, I mean we talked to threat actors, we talked to red teamers, we talked to folks from the intelligence community, we talked to defenders too, right? But what we really wanted to do was understand from the point of view of the adversary, what are they doing? Right. And so we took Frank's profile and Matt's profile and a bunch of other people's profiles, and we said, hello, attacker 1 and attacker 2 and red teamer 3, etc. Here's Frank, here's Matt. What do you do? Right? How do you attack them? What is it that you actually do? What are you looking for? And we did this across hundreds of different profiles. And what we discovered actually was that there was a lot of similar data that was being leveraged in these different attackers, regardless of kind of the geography or what their motivations might be. They were really focused on coming after LinkedIn data. That was their number one data source because it's a strong correlation between Frank and his company, right? They were then using that typically to pivot into data broker information or other sort of deep web data where they can say, okay, I see, I know this business information about Frank, but I actually need some personal information. So they find your personal mobile number, they find your personal email, your family information, where you live, right? They use that to pivot into other data sources, other social media, maybe your Twitter, maybe your Instagram, whatever it might be. And then they take all that data and then they start hunting in dark web, right? Looking for breach information that they can use to try to break in directly, right? Just through credential reuse and those kinds of things. So when we talk about human attack surface, those are the 3 core elements of the problem. And those are the most common pieces of data that all threat actors are looking for when they're trying to come after, you and me. There's always some anomalous piece of data that's out there. Everybody has a slightly different footprint, but it's really that core of that human attack surfaces that expose PII that's out there about each of us. We can talk a little bit about other company data that gets wrapped into that too, which sometimes is interesting, but on the human side, it's really those pieces of information.
Yeah, and that leads a couple of different paths in my brain to go down. I think the first one that I wanted to touch on though was so to your name, right? Problem in the chair. So you're dealing with a lot of sensitive information about in this case, the employees of this organization. And you're trying to recognize where there could be problems before there are problems. But how do you get around this mindset of protecting the individual, but not making the individual look bad, if you will?
Yeah, so we have a really outcomes-driven focus, right? So, what we're trying to do is actually make Frank harder to attack. And whether this piece of data that's sitting out there about Frank, is, on site X, site Y, or site Z, it kind of doesn't matter too much, right? Because the threat actor is using it. And so we try to come at this really from the privacy side of the fence in terms of how we solve the problem. There are plenty of tools that someone can buy or leverage to from an insider threat point of view or whatever, where you can do as much introspection as you want on a human, right? There's no guardrails there. And we've kind of come at it from the other side. We see all the data, we know what's out there, but we're only surfacing the pieces of data that are really important for a security organization. And our focus is on outcomes, right? So we're just removing the data, we're neutralizing it, we're working through integrations into the organization to actually blunt the effect of that exposed data. Like the fact that my birthday is out there and you know how old I am, so some people are concerned about that as an example, right? Like we just don't tell you what the birthday is. What does it matter, right? We just say like, hey, there's birthday information exposed. Like the actual underlying data is not important. It's just the fact that it's there.
So, yeah, it's a delicate line, right? Trying to be able to be sensitive to the people, but also give enough information so that it can get resolved, and make sure that everybody's working towards like, no, we're doing this for good, right? And making sure that's there. I remember the first time you talked to me and I heard about your solution, right? It was really fascinating, and it's like, wow, that could be great. Let's protect me. And it's like I'm somewhat terrified about what it's going to find, but it's
right.
like
if I could hand you a tin hat, I would, right?
Yeah, so no, that's great, and I think that's a really interesting part. And I think the other thing that had come to mind when you went through your narrative there is I remember, right? I mean, I'm very much been ingrained with attack through my time at MITRE and right. I told the post breach story and said, don't worry about just the keeping the AV up to date, right? We have to look at the entire way, and so I am definitely biased towards looking down the attack matrix, if you will.
Sure.
But one of the interesting things is I was doing an engagement for Red Team, And we did all the activity. But what we found, the thing that made the findings actually relevant to the key stakeholders was when we were able to pull the thread on, and this is what your surface was in the public space. And so we were able to find that you worked here, that this contract was made, and show that this is why we had this entry point, right? Because a lot of the presumed breach is great, but like they're like, you won't actually get in, and we were able to like show that immediate path. So I will say, like, what you're protecting is something that as a red team we were doing, and that was like the key story to be able to show how everything came together. And so definitely resonate with it's what adversaries do and what they need to do.
And I think that's one of the challenges that that we've seen that some security teams have, right? Is they have this very defensive mindset, which is important. It's critical for doing their job, right? But you actually have to almost like step out of that mindset and shift over into a different way of thinking to say like, okay, well, what if I could actually make it so that I got less attacks, right? If it was actually harder for this to happen, and that requires a shift in mindset, a shift in the way that you think about the problem. Yeah, it's a really exciting approach to, that solves the problem in a different way.
Well, to that point, and you even used the word a couple times there, the shift word. So shift left. It's something that is actually a newer concept to me, is like that nice phrase. But I've actually heard it a couple times in a couple different talks today. And it's one of those things that seems to be resonating with the more sophisticated users. But I'm curious about somebody that's living it like you are. Are you finding, how are you finding the enterprises are embracing or adopting shift left? Are you finding that it's still the more forward-looking ones? Are you finding that it's going down more stream? Like where do you find it's like the sweet spot for people that are having this?
Yeah, I think they're it's a great question, right? I think that we work with customers and we see folks that are on both sides of the spectrum, right? We see folks that have more sophisticated operations, more sophisticated SOCs that are spending a lot of money to try to solve this problem, before they ever met us, right? In different ways. And then we have folks that maybe have smaller budgets, smaller teams, but they recognize, that nearly every problem that they're working on has started with the human, right? And what we hear from them is, hey, we keep giving folks security training, and the people who always click, and it's the problem just kind of doesn't get any better, and so they want to try a different approach, and they want to try to solve that problem differently. So I think we've seen a pretty wide range. I think on the more sophisticated side, in terms of larger, more mature organizations, I think what's been really interesting is actually a lot of them are already spending quite a lot of money to solve this problem today, and they don't really realize it, right? So if you look across programs for things like high value protection, if you're doing, and sometimes this sits in physical security, where you're doing sort of VIP protection or those kinds of things. Your threat intelligence team is maybe working on trying to clean up the footprints of your board members or your executive team, these kinds of ideas, never mind security awareness training or certain activities that are happening inside the SOC or incident response, right? Like a lot of the dollars that are being spent are dedicated to this human attack surface problem. It's just called different things, right? It's sort of, so it's interesting in that way.
I think one of the other things, thinking about the thing that resonates with me in this, and it kind of went to the story I told earlier, but one of the things that I love is it's got the actual employee's best interest in mind too, right? It's like that nice perk. Yeah, it's securing the organization, but it's actually also just improving my online profile that everybody's telling me is just out there for everybody to get, right? And so I know I am personally more secure when the company does this. So it's actually a nice little like human relations benefit too, from my standpoint. So I think that's a really interesting take.
For sure. Yeah, I think that the idea that we can make you safer at work and safer at home actually is a nice benefit for people, and framing it that way is important, right? Because it is a benefit, right? If you, from a business point of view, if your employee is compromised at home, like it actually has direct benefit for them, not only at home but also at work, and for the business too. Because if I'm distracted by a breach at home, maybe it's not even related to work, right? It actually makes me less effective in the office, right? So there are many ways in which this problem is the lines have blurred between home and work, and I think as we've all lived in the last few years,
Yeah.
but this is just a way to try to maybe combat some of that too.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. So we've talked a little about the different security strategies that can exist, right? So there's the keep the bad guys out. There's the find the bad guys because they're going to get in. There's the now your approach on looking more upstream. But really, right, it's not about one of those. It's about how those come together. So interested in how Picnic helps the traditional security. So I don't want to change my strategy, but I do want to benefit from what you guys are providing me. So how does what Picnic does help my other tools that I already have?
Sure. Yeah, great question. So there's a bunch of ways to think about this. I think maybe a top level concept would be really prioritization and focus. So there are many ways that folks are already thinking about how do I prioritize and focus in my SOC or my ops team when it comes to things like vulnerabilities, threat intelligence, et cetera. So what we have, one of the things that we have is actually a human layer that lets you prioritize your actions based on the biggest vector, right? And so because we're looking at Frank and we're looking at Matt and we're looking at everyone in the organization, we can actually tell you who's most likely to be targeted and how, so that you can take the right actions, right? And one thing that's pretty cool is we're also mapping that to threat intelligence, right? So if you know that APT 29, choose your favorite APT, whatever, is leveraging a certain set of TTPs to come after your organization, we've actually made the mapping between the techniques that they're using into the footprint of the human, right? So if we know that they're leveraging SMS-based, attack, let's just say, the folks that do not have a public mobile number are much less likely to be attacked. So worry less about them, right? But the ones that are, that actually have that exposed mobile number, like, you should probably focus on them in terms of awareness, in terms of maybe endpoint isolation, through EDR, whatever your methodology might be. So those are some of the ways that our customers are thinking about how to make their existing tool sets better, to make them predictive in a way.
That's really smart, because I think what I hear from a lot of organizations and going in my threat hunting days is when you do threat hunting, right, it's so hard to deal with what is noise, where do you start looking, right? Because you do that initial search, you get this long list of results, and sure, you can go through the page after page of them and figure out, okay, is this normal, is this not normal? But being able to have that initial list to kind of say, okay, these are our high priority ones, is anything malicious here or anything suspicious here even? And to have that whittled down, I think, is a really, really interesting way of providing this non-traditional data source to help supplement some of these noisier analytics that are happening on the EDR side. It's really
I think the one of the most valuable, if not the most valuable resource in every security team is actually the human, right? And freeing them up, getting them to focus on the most high value thing that they can do is a critical task for every security team, I would say. So this is one way that we can help really focus those valuable resources, those humans, on the thing that matters, which happen to be humans in this case.
Yeah, and it's a very non-traditional data source, but I love it. In terms of right, we think about fusing network and endpoint together, and then in the XDR revolution, how to pull cloud in and stuff like that. But this is a very non-traditional one that could provide some really good benefits. So that's really interesting. So I think that pretty much wraps up most of my questions that I had, but I do want to give you a chance to provide any additional context, any additional content you want to kind of go down, any paths that we didn't touch on.
Yeah, I think one thing that's worth mentioning is, we've invested nearly $20 million so far in building this capability, more than 65 staff here. So there's been really a tremendous investment in the underlying tech, in the IP that created it. And one of the things that we want to do for the community is actually expose some of that in a free way, in an open source way. And so one of the things we've done actually is we have created what we're calling HASP, or the Human Attack Surface Protection Framework, which is an open source, publicly available framework that maps all of the different human attack surface challenges against MITRE. It also has a mapping over to NIST CSF. And there's been some amazing collaborators on this with us, and we're super excited to launch it and make it available to the public. And so, stay tuned, I guess, for a little bit more about that. But that's something that I think can be good for everyone. You don't need to have Picnic solution to be able to look at the framework, understand how do you, where do you have some gaps based on what you're currently doing. Obviously, we'd love to help if that makes sense, but there are plenty of ways to try to solve this problem. If you understand it, you can wrap your hands around it, which is part of what we're trying to do with the framework, to say, here it is, right? This is how big it is. This is what it looks like. This is the problem. And sometimes framing the problem is the first step in solving it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you think about a lot of the metaphors that are made around that helped kind of vocalize what attack's value was like the kind of concept around castles and defenses, right? And right, that what was being said is discourage just building a taller wall, right?
Deeper moats, higher walls, right?
Yeah, deeper moats. But what's interesting is like this is building that moat, right? It's like looking out beyond the walls and building that extra layer of defense around you. And there's a lot of interesting things that you can do to kind of get out in front of it. And anyways, I really appreciate your time and perspective. And as I said, I think this is a nice little innovative product space that I'm seeing emerge from you and others that are trying to get non-traditional defenses, think about things in a different way, think about how to get ahead of the adversary, increase the cost, as you've pointed out through this talk. And so really encourage people to look at Picnic and what else they can do beyond just what is status quo and defenses, and think about what else can we be doing to protect ourselves and tackling some of these other types of techniques that might matter to you. So really appreciate it. Appreciate everybody for listening in today. Thank you, Matt, for joining us. And
thanks for having me, Frank. Great discussion, great questions. Excited about what you guys are building at Tidal. I think it's also really impactful, and for folks to be able to understand, where can they make moves inside of MITRE to better protect themselves, right? So I think it's really excellent, and kudos to all the great work your team is doing.
I really appreciate that. So if you're interested in seeing how Picnic covers the attack matrix, feel free to go to app.tidalcyber.com, where you can see Picnic now in the platform. And if you have interest in sharing more information in the platform, feel free to reach out to us. But otherwise, thank you for listening, and please join us next time. Thank you very much.